The photograph had sat unnoticed for decades, pressed between birth certificates and yellowing receipts in a plain cardboard box that smelled faintly of dust and metal. It showed a family posed stiffly in their living room, a father with tired eyes, a mother holding a practiced smile, and between them a boy of about 10, hands folded, posture too formal for his age. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first glance. The lighting was flat, the composition ordinary, the kind of image millions of families once took to prove they had existed together at least once. It wasn't until the scan was enlarged on a high-resolution screen that the room went quiet. At first, the experts thought it was a trick of the software, compression noise, maybe, or a flaw in the aging film. Someone adjusted the contrast. Someone else leaned closer. The boy's face sharpened, while the rest of the photograph remained unchanged, as if the image itself were resisting the scrutiny. His expression was calm, almost polite, yet there was something wrong with the eyes. Not their shape, not their color, but their focus. They weren't fixed on the camera. They seemed to be fixed on the viewer. As the zoom increased, faint details emerged that hadn't existed a moment before. Hairline cracks of shadow beneath the pupils, reflections that didn't match the room, a depth that suggested the image extended inward rather than back. One technician laughed nervously and said it looked like the boy had been pasted in later. Another whispered that it looked like he was waiting. No one noticed when the timestamp on the file changed on its own. By the time they tried to pull up the original negative, the boy's face was all anyone could see. The restoration began as a routine procedure, the kind archivists performed dozens of times a week on aging photographs that had lost their sharpness to time. The image itself was unremarkable, a family arranged in the careful symmetry of an era that valued stillness over comfort. The father stood rigid, one hand resting too deliberately on the back of a chair, while the mother's smile seemed practiced, as though she had rehearsed it in a mirror before the shutter clicked. Between them was the boy, their son, smaller than expected for his age. Dressed in a buttoned shirt that looked slightly too neat, as if it had never been worn before that moment. When the original scan appeared on the screen, no one paused. It looked exactly as it should have. The first pass of digital enhancement corrected scratches and balanced the exposure, peeling back the fog that decades had laid over the image. Faces became clearer, fabric gained texture, and the room behind them, once a blur, revealed a patterned wall and the faint outline of a clock. It was only when the software isolated facial details for sharpening that something subtle shifted. The algorithm lingered longer on the boy's face than on the others, as if encountering resistance. His features sharpened faster, more decisively, while the parents remained slightly soft around the edges. A technician adjusted the zoom, not out of concern but curiosity. At higher magnification, the boy's eyes retained clarity, while everything else began to break down into pixels. That alone was unusual. Old photographs rarely behaved that way. Someone suggested lens distortion, another blamed uneven lighting, but neither explanation fit. The lighting across the photograph was consistent, and the lens artifacts would have affected the entire image, not just one face. When contrast was increased, faint inconsistencies appeared within the eyes themselves. The reflections were wrong, catching shapes that didn't exist anywhere else in the room. The pupils seemed too deep, holding shadow long after surrounding areas had brightened. It wasn't dramatic, not something that would alarm a casual viewer, but to professionals who had spent years studying images, it felt like a quiet violation of rules they understood instinctively. They compared the enhanced version with the raw scan, then with the physical photograph under magnification. The distortion did not exist on the paper. It only emerged digitally, as though it required attention to reveal itself. Each time they zoomed in, The effect became more defined, never exaggerated, never obvious, but persistent enough to demand explanation. The boy's expression did not change, yet it began to feel less like a captured moment and more like a held one, suspended with intent, as if the photograph were no longer simply showing what had been there, but slowly allowing something to be seen that had been waiting for the right kind of focus, the right level of scrutiny, and the precise moment when someone would finally look close enough to notice that the image was no longer behaving like a photograph at all. Once the initial anomaly was documented, the team approached it the way they always did, by trying to break it. They ran the image through multiple restoration programs, each built on different algorithms, different assumptions about how light, shadow, and grain should behave. The expectation was simple. If the distortion in the boy's face was a software artifact, it would disappear, or at least change character, when processed differently. Instead, it persisted. No matter which system they used, the same subtle irregularity emerged in the same place, as though each program were uncovering the same buried feature, rather than inventing one of its own. They began isolating variables. The resolution was lowered, then raised far beyond what the original film should have supported. Noise reduction was turned off entirely. Color channels were separated and analyzed individually. In the red channel, the boy's eyes appeared darker than physics allowed. In the blue, they carried a faint halo that did not correspond to any reflective surface in the room. The green channel, usually the most forgiving, showed a slight asymmetry, a depth that suggested layering rather than flat exposure. None of it aligned with known photographic flaws. Scratches, dust, chemical decay, and lens aberrations all followed recognizable patterns. This did not. The most unsettling discovery came when they began a comparative zoom test. Each time the image was magnified, the distortion did not simply become larger. It became more precise. Edges refined themselves. Shadows deepened selectively. It was as if the photograph were responding to the act of observation, offering more detail only when demanded. One analyst remarked, half-jokingly, that it behaved more like a 3D render than a static image. No one laughed. To rule out coincidence, they overlaid the results from multiple zoom levels. The distortion did not scale uniformly. Small changes appeared at different magnifications, always within the boundaries of the boy's face, never bleeding into the background or the parents beside him. This violated one of the most basic expectations of image processing. Artifacts did not know what they were depicting. They spread, they degraded, they corrupted indiscriminately. This anomaly seemed selective. A historian suggested referencing the image with known cases of double exposure or composite photography from the same period. The team pulled examples from archives, studying how layered images interacted under enhancement. Those flaws revealed themselves immediately: ghosting outlines, mismatched lighting, faint overlaps. The boy's face showed none of that. It was integrated perfectly, too perfectly, as if it belonged there more completely than the rest of the photograph. As the hours passed, fatigue set in, and with it a creeping unease. Several team members reported the same sensation without prompting, a feeling that the longer they stared at the magnified image, the more the boy's gaze seemed to settle, not drifting, not unfocused, but fixed with increasing certainty. It was not the look of a child caught by a camera, but of something aware that it was being examined, something that remained unchanged across every test, every zoom, every attempt to explain it away, leaving them with the growing realization that they were no longer analyzing a flaw in the photograph, but encountering a consistency that should not exist at all. The next step was meant to ground the investigation in something solid, something immune to interpretation. If the image itself refused to explain the anomaly, the records would. Names were taken from the envelope the photograph had been stored in, penciled carefully in a hand that had faded but remained legible. The parents were easy to trace. Census data confirmed their address, their occupations. Even the layout of the house matched the room in the photograph. Marriage certificates, tax records, church registries all aligned neatly, forming a reassuring spine of documented reality. For a brief moment, the tension in the room eased. Then they searched for the son. His name appeared only once, in a birth record dated a decade earlier. After that, there was nothing. No school enrollment, no vaccination log, no census listing. At first, this was attributed to incomplete archives, a common problem with older records. But the absence was too clean. Children left traces, even brief ones. Teachers recorded attendance. Doctors recorded illnesses. Churches recorded baptisms and funerals. The database returned nothing. As if the boy had stepped into existence for the camera and nowhere else. A junior researcher widened the search parameters, combing through regional death notices. That was when the entry appeared, buried in a scanned ledger from a neighboring county. The name matched. The parents' names matched. The cause of death was listed as a sudden illness, the date clearly printed. The year was unmistakable. It was 5 years before the photograph was taken. At first, the team assumed an error. Clerical mistakes happened, especially in rural records. They checked again, then again, pulling the original scan of the ledger. The ink was consistent. The handwriting matched surrounding entries. The page showed no signs of alteration. A margin note referenced burial records, which led to a small cemetery several miles away. Photographs of the headstone, uploaded decades later by a volunteer, showed the same name, the same dates. The stone was weathered but intact. The death had been acknowledged, marked, mourned. Silence settled over the room as the implications surfaced. Someone pointed out that families sometimes reused names for children born later. That theory collapsed when the birth record was re-examined. There was no second birth. No gap that could suggest another child. The parents had only one son. According to every official document that existed, the photograph was dated conclusively through chemical analysis of the paper and comparison with known prints from the same studio. It could not have been taken earlier. The parents were visibly older than in earlier family images found elsewhere in the archive. The clock on the wall, now clearer after enhancement, matched a model released years after the recorded death. The boy in the photograph did not belong in that moment. According to the records, he could not have been alive to stand between his parents, hands folded, eyes focused forward. Yet there he was, captured with more clarity than anyone else in the frame, occupying a space that paperwork insisted had been empty for years, forcing the team to confront a discrepancy that could not be corrected with better data, because the more they verified, the more certain it became that the photograph was not merely mistaken, but documenting a presence that history itself denied. The shift from professional concern to personal disturbance happened so gradually that no one could identify the exact moment it began. At first, the effects were dismissed as stress, the predictable result of long hours spent staring at a single unsettling image. The human brain, after all, was skilled at inventing patterns when deprived of rest. Yet the similarities were too precise to ignore. One archivist mentioned waking from a dream in which a boy stood in a narrow hallway, his face calm, his eyes reflecting light from no visible source. Another, hours later and unaware of the first account, described the same hallway, the same stillness, the same unsettling sense of being observed rather than observing. The team compared notes reluctantly, half expecting embarrassment, half fearing confirmation. The descriptions aligned with disturbing accuracy. The boy was always silent. He never moved closer, never farther away. He simply remained, occupying space with an unnatural certainty. What troubled them most was that his face in these dreams was sharper than in the photograph. as if the image they had been studying was incomplete, a preliminary version of something more detailed that existed elsewhere. During waking hours, the influence persisted in subtler ways. Several members began sketching absent-mindedly during meetings, only to later realize they had drawn the same thing. A child's face with eyes shaded too deeply, framed by lines that suggested depth rather than contour. None of them remembered deciding to draw it. The sketches appeared in margins of notebooks, on scrap paper near keyboards, even on the backs of printed reports. When placed side by side, they were nearly identical. Sleep deprivation was ruled out when one analyst, who had deliberately avoided looking at the image for 2 days, reported the same dream after briefly passing through the lab where the photograph was displayed on a monitor. Another claimed that while reviewing unrelated files, he felt an inexplicable pressure behind his eyes, followed by a fleeting impression of being watched from just outside his field of vision. Medical explanations were considered and discarded one by one. No toxins, no electromagnetic interference, no shared medication. The only common factor was exposure to the image. Attempts were made to restrict access. The photograph was removed from the main workspace and stored on an isolated server. The physical print was sealed in a light-proof container. For a short time, the disturbances lessened. Then the dreams returned, more vivid than before, as though absence had sharpened them. One night, a technician reported hearing a soft, rhythmic sound in his apartment, like fingers tapping glass. He found himself standing in front of his computer, without remembering how he got there. The screen awake, displaying a magnified portion of the boy's face that he did not recall opening. The idea that the image was influencing perception gave way to something more unsettling. The effects were not random. They were consistent, shared, and cumulative, suggesting not a psychological reaction, but a form of contact, a low-level communication that did not rely on language or sound. The boy in the photograph was no longer confined to paper or pixels. Through repeated attention, through analysis and fixation, he seemed to be establishing a presence that extended beyond the frame, imprinting himself onto those who studied him, not aggressively, not violently, but with a quiet persistence that implied intent, as though being seen was not the end goal, but only the first step in a process that none of them yet understood. The final revelation did not arrive as a single discovery, but as an alignment of smaller certainties that locked together with unsettling precision. The team stopped asking what the photograph showed and began asking what it was doing. Time-stamped backups revealed a pattern they had previously dismissed as coincidence. Each time the image was accessed, copied, or enhanced, subtle metadata changes appeared, not random corruption but consistent additions, as if information were being written rather than lost. File sizes increased by negligible amounts, fractions of a percent, yet those fractions accumulated across versions, suggesting growth rather than degradation. A theoretical specialist proposed an uncomfortable analogy. Some systems, he explained, did not record events but states. They preserved conditions, holding them stable against change. The photograph, viewed through that lens, was not capturing a family at a moment in time, but maintaining the presence of the boy within a defined boundary. The image did not age him, did not alter him. It refreshed him. Each act of observation reinforced the state it preserved, much like a loop that corrected itself whenever disruption was introduced. This theory gained weight when they examined early scans alongside the most recent ones. The parents showed minor variations consistent with restoration differences, but the boy did not. His features aligned perfectly across all versions, down to the smallest pixel-level comparison. In effect, he was the most stable element in the image, immune to both time and processing. It was as if the photograph were anchored around him, not the other way around. The question of intent could no longer be avoided. If the image was preserving something, it was doing so selectively. The boy was not merely present, he was prioritized. The parents existed almost as context, necessary elements to legitimize the scene. Without them, the photograph would raise immediate suspicion. With them, it passed as ordinary, a disguise so effective it had lasted for decades. This suggested design, not chance. A final test was proposed, one no one wanted to perform, but all agreed was necessary. They isolated the image and attempted to degrade it deliberately, introducing controlled corruption meant to erase detail beyond recovery. The background dissolved as expected. The parents blurred into abstraction. The boy's face resisted longer than any other part, retaining coherence, even as surrounding data collapsed. When it finally broke down, it did not vanish. It reorganized, reforming into a simplified but unmistakable version of the same face, eyes intact, gaze unchanged. That was when the conclusion settled in, heavy and unavoidable. The photograph was not a passive container. It was a mechanism. It did not remember the boy, it sustained him. Whatever had been lost years before the image was taken had found a way to remain, using the rules of representation as structure, using attention as reinforcement. The boy did not need to move, speak, or change. Existence within the frame was enough, as long as someone continued to look, continued to acknowledge, continued to keep the system active. The horror was not that the photograph contained something unnatural, but that it had succeeded in doing exactly what it was meant to do, preserving a presence that should have ended, and ensuring that as long as the image survived, so would the thing it held, patiently occupying a moment that never truly passed.